Tatiana Stanton, as well as being the Cornell goat and sheep extension specialist. I also operate my own pasture-based meat goat farm. I'm talking off of a fairly old rural Wi-Fi connection right now. So I'm actually going to stop my picture. You won't be able to see me. Can everyone still hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can. We can hear you.
And I'm going to go ahead and get started. Lots of this information and some of these photos and slides I've taken from other people, and a bunch of them are listed on this first slide here. And I thank them all very much. And for some reason, I'm having trouble going to the next slide. Okay. So your management is going to vary depending on your objectives and also on the livestock species that you have available to work with. And first off, it's good to know what your objectives are. Are you wanting to eradicate undesirable invasive wooding plants in forests or pastures? Are you instead trying to sustain high quality forage browse for your goats or other animals? Are you renovating abandoned hayfields, orchards, and vineyards? Or are you primarily wanting to maintain a silvopasture system? And a silvopasture system would be sustainable production of tree crops, forages, and livestock, all on the same land. Each livestock species has its own unique characteristics. For example, in this slide, we're looking at mouth width, and you can see that cattle, when you look at their jaws versus their mouth, they're pretty similar widths. Versus you look at sheep and the mouth is tapered more compared to the jaw. And then on a goat, the mouth and nostrils are much more tapered. Okay. So when we look at cattle, we generally consider them grazers. So eating grass and forage legumes that are on ground level as compared to intermediate feeders or browsers. And their large, strong tongue is designed to wrap around big tufts of grass and pull those into their mouth. And they have a digestive capability that allows them to handle large quantities of forage that may be of relatively low quality. They're large-hooved, heavy animals, and so because of this, they have a potential to cause a lot of damage to soils as far as compaction and erosion, damage to tree feeder roots, etc. But that same heavy mass makes them good steamrollers as far as being able to break through a thicketed area and open it up to other animals or to humans to get in there to do some brush clearing or whatever. And most predators are not an issue in the United States for grown cows and steers, and they're fairly easy to fence. For example, in a properly managed silvopasture system where you're moving your cattle rapidly and at pretty high density, but with lots of fresh quality feed in front of them all the time, you may be able to get by in your subdivisions of having a single strand 3 millimeter braided polytwine as the fence that's keeping them in, where that's usually not going to work well at all for your goats or your sheep. Sheep are considered intermediate feeders. They tend to prefer grasses and forbs. If you don't know what forbs are, we would consider them easy, maybe not completely correct definition would be that they're herbaceous, so non-woody broadleaf plants, as opposed to browse being your woody broadleaf shrubs. So sheep are excellent on forbs compared to actually compared often to your goats and your cattle. But like I say, they tend to prefer grasses and they're also able to graze browse. They usually won't stand up on their hind feet and stuff. So you'll usually, when they're grazing browse, get a pretty distinct grazing line there. And they like to graze close to the ground. Their split lip allows them to do that. And this actually works great with grasses or any plant that's growing from its crowns, because it allows them to get that the newest growth from those crowns. That too can make them somewhat damaging if they're overgrazing on these plants that propagate from, or grow from the crowns. They're very susceptible to predators, and they're generally not jumpers. So therefore, if you're fencing them in with electronets, you can often get away with a 35 high, 35-inch tall electronet. Goats are also considered intermediate grazers or intermediate feeders. They tend to prefer browse, but they also graze grasses and forbs. They crave variety, so they're very much on the move. So often it can be beneficial to keep them into an electronet fence, so they're forced to sort of concentrate on eating in a specific area. Again, susceptible to predators because they do have more of a tendency to jump and challenge fences. When you're using electronet, you may be finding yourself having to go with a 42-inch high fence. They're probably the most challenging when it comes to fencing. They're very social animals, just like all the other ruminants. They learn their eating habits from the herd, but they take this to an extraordinary level and have all sorts of patterns of snorting and stuff when they eat something that they don't like. They have a larger liver for their weight, which allows them to process secondary compounds a little faster than your other ruminants, your tannins, etc. They have salivary glands that are equipped to bind tannins, and because of this, tannins tend not to cause the feed depression or the appetite depression that we see in other animals when they eat tannins. Goats are generally more agile than sheep, and this allows them to clear brush in areas that might be more that are inaccessible to machinery or too environmentally sensitive. However, they tend to be more susceptible than sheep to the internal parasites that are found in conventional pastures. And you can see here, we've got some fairly steep terrain here that in the middle photo that the goats have been in for about 7 days, and yet you really don't see much erosion there at all. They cleared it out compared to the plot on the left-hand side of that same photo that hasn't been grazed yet, and yet you don't see erosion in there. And I can see I have a slide upside down or to the side here, but it's just showing a bunch of my very young goat, recently weaned goat kids at my farm playing tag on a fallen tree. And then you can see goats standing on their legs to graze browse or graze tree leaves there on the right-hand photo. Goats have a mobile upper lip along with their tapered muzzle, and this allows them to be very selective eaters. They can easily graze brambles without chewing on the thorns. As you can see on that right-hand figure, they've taken all the leaves off of that berry branch, and yet have not eaten the thorns or the twigs there. And on the side on the left, or photo on the left with the goldenrod, you can see that they've stripped the goldenrod of all its leaves and yet left the stems. So they can exercise a lot of selection in their eating. Sheep don't have this mobile upper lip and therefore aren't quite as able to manipulate higher canopy food like this. Goats and sheep are small ruminants, so they have a more rapid rate of passage of food through their digestive tract and through their rumen than cattle. Because of this, they don't utilize mature, highly fibrous forages as well as cattle do, and therefore, depending on their stage of production, for the same stage of production, they may require better quality forage than both large ruminants and horses. So therefore, the fermentable fiber content of their forage is very important. And fermentable fiber is simply a fancy name for the fiber that the rumen microbes can digest, i.e. the high quality forage or high quality fiber. Basically, what your ruminant animals have evolved to eat, to to survive on. And that should be the main carbohydrate in their diet, is this fermentable fiber. As far as age, sex, and breed, it's good to keep in mind that goats and sheep under 1 year of age only have baby teeth. These baby teeth, compared to mature teeth, are less able to girdle hard bark on trees and stuff. And therefore, they can be, these animals that are under 1 year of age can be safer on valuable timber or in your sugar maples. It's sort of elementary, but keep in mind that if you're getting a flock of animals, mixtures of females and uncastrated males leads to baby animals, and you may not want to be taking that on. The size of your sheep or goats affects how high the animals can reach. Baby doll sheep aren't going to be able to graze as high a browse line as, you know, Great Big Suffolk could. Possibly longer legged breeds are more likely to stand on their hind legs and get higher into the browse this way, or to climb into browse. But I've seen some fairly short-legged boar goats that have done pretty good jobs at this. It seems in part that behavior is maybe learned from their moms more, or just some animals are just more content to be on their hind legs. How you manage your browse and your woods, how you manage your goats and your sheep and your browse and your woods depends a lot on whether you're trying to eradicate the browse or you're trying to sustain it. And this will affect the decisions you make on when you're going to graze it, how much defoliation you're going to allow, and how often in a grazing period. So depending on your objective, this photo on the right might be horrifying to you, or might be just what you're wanting, okay? And if you're trying to sustain browse, it's very important to do a few things. One, don't browse it early in the grazing season before the root reserves are exhausted, before the root reserves have replenished themselves. Early in the season, they're exhausted from putting out all that spring growth. And don't graze it late in the season, after the leaves have started to fall, because then the goats are going to tend to be more likely to girdle the trunks and branches. Also early in the season, just like with your maples, a lot of these plants start collecting some sugars under the bark, and they're very appetizing for the animals to girdle. So if you want to keep them, early in the season and late in the season aren't the times you want to graze them. If you're trying to eradicate them, those are good seasons to graze them. And then don't defoliate your browse more than about 66%. Don't return onto it before the leaf growth has completely recovered. Because of these two things, we're often able to graze browse only about once or twice in a season, if your primary goal is to maintain that browse. So basically, we're wanting to move through it fast. We're wanting with a high density of animals. We want to stay on each section a very short time, rest each section a long time. This is very similar to how you would manage a silvopasture. In quick, out fast, stay out for a pretty long time. Okay. The big photo on the right is a picture of a field at my farm that when we moved here 30 years ago, it was completely brambles and Multiflora Rose. And we wanted to keep it that way. We had lots of conventional pastures, and we wanted this pasture to be one that we could move animals through grazing paddocks in it. In late July, August, when the worms had got, internal parasites had gotten bad in our conventional pastures. Unfortunately, a neighbor's employee got confused and somehow managed to get a brush hog over onto our property. So not even on the right property to graze, to mow the wrong field. And they made it about halfway through this field, despite all this polywire fencing we had set up, before they punctured a tire in our thick brambles and quit. But the damage had already been done, and it had been done in two ways. One, because I was only grazing it once a year, I felt that I could go ahead and do 100% defoliation. And I didn't realize that the aspens in this field I was really just knocking back the suckers on them. So they were really knocked back. The goats hadn't made it into the densest parts of the Multiflora Rose and bramble thickets. But once that mower came in and made some paths into there, the goats immediately started parasitizing that and or predating that, really started to graze it. And so I was left instead with the field you see there on both sides where there's, it's mostly goldenrod with a little bit of brush in it. And so what we ended up having to do is we went ahead and broadcast, frost seeded in bird's foot trefoil, which tends to survive in a fairly acidic soil, and can use that goldenrod to help keep the bird's foot trefoil as it gets heavy from lodging over quite as much. But it wasn't what we had planned for that pasture. And will your animals require supplemental feed? And sheep and cattle generally have a hard time maintaining condition on browse alone. It's best to have a good ground cover for them, grasses, forbs, and legumes as well. Good quality browse usually deteriorates in feed quality over a growing season, slower than your grasses and forage and legumes in a conventional pasture. Depending on the stage of growth of your goats and sheep and the acreage you have available, you may find that well-managed browse is sufficient to meet their needs without any other supplement. However, when you're trying to eradicate invasives, you leave animals in far longer often than optimum, or at higher densities than optimum, because you're trying to get them to girdle the trunk, strip bark, and eat twigs. And because of that, there's usually not sufficient quantity and quality of browse in that whole time you have them in there to sustain animals without you doing supplemental feeding. We're now going to switch over to controlling, talking about if your objective is to control invasive species. And these are some young goats this year over towards the Hudson Valley in a brush area. And you can see that in just a few days, they've cleared out that area pretty well. They would obviously probably have to do repeated grazings on this to knock it down permanently. But right now they've opened it up for a lot of grasses and ground level legumes to grow up in there. I'm going to go through the example of a study we did many in the early 2000s at the Cornell Arnett Forest. It was the Goats in the Woods project, and it was started because of too much of the wrong thing. We had in the Arnett Forest, there was a lot of, just like at a lot of other woodlots, there was a lot of American beech and striped maple proliferating in the understory. And these thickets of saplings were excluding a lot of the desirable hardwoods, saplings from being able to survive, limiting easy access into these woods, and reducing the forest diversity. And here's just an example of that year, what the makeup of the seedlings and saplings were. So when you look at the sugar maples seedlings, and the red maple seedlings, you can see that there's quite a lot of them. But then when you look at saplings, you see that they're being crowded out by the American beech and the striped maple. And there's actually very, very few of them. They're being shaded out and aren't surviving, or they're being preferentially grazed by the deer. And a lot of it is preferential grazing by deer. And so the thought was that if they could bring in goats into these areas for a couple of, and use them there for a couple of years, that they could get, really set back the striped maple and the American beech and open things up to therefore let seedlings grow in of your more desirable, valuable hardwoods and proliferate. Traditionally, we would go in with beech and striped maple and try and do chemical or mechanical clearing. But this may not be available to smaller woodlots. You may not have the accessibility in certain woodlots to get machinery or herbicide treatments into there. The cost may be prohibitive, or the labor, or there may be safety issues if the owner is trying to do this themselves. So in the Arnott Forest, this was our field setup. We used electronet fences. We wanted things to be flexible and yet secure. So because we were working with goats, we were using 42-inch electronet fences, easy to handle, good visibility, white fences. We were grazing, the electronets tend to come in 150 and 75-foot lengths. Actually, I think it's 165-foot lengths. So we were grazing about 0.1 hectares or a quarter acre. And then we had a charger and a 12-volt battery. Solar chargers may not work well in these setups unless you've got a lot of sunlight getting to them. And in our situations, we usually didn't have a lot of sunlight in there. You wanted adequate grounding, and we pretty much felt that you had to have at least 3,000 volts at any one time of a low impedance type fence. And then we had weather shelters in there, even though we were grazing at a time of year, that's not very hard on animals, just because it did rain a lot. And in some cases, you may want some sun protection for animals. Also, these weather shelters act as a security blanket or homing area for animals. We would have goats that would jump out of this electronet now and then. And yet they were, when nighttime came, they definitely wanted to jump in there. When something frightened them, they wanted to jump back into these areas. And these areas had small little pens, hog panel pens or livestock panel pens under them. And so we were able, when we were moving fence to a new area, we could corral the animals in these night shelters that were within the grazing pen and keep them there while we were moving the fence if we hadn't already moved extra electronets over to a new area beforehand. And the animals we had in these pens, we started out with either groups of 5 or 20 juvenile animals, so weaned goat kids that weren't a year old yet. Most of these had been just, were like 3 months old at the start of the study. And we started out with groups of 5 or 20. And then later on, we had also mature groups of 20 goats, but we found that we could only leave mature goats in a quarter acre area for 3 to 4 days. These areas are not dense in things like Multiflora Rose and stuff. Instead, they've got striped maple and beech there. And basically the animals would finish grazing the leaves off of all the understory within the first day or two. And then there was really no food for them except for girdling the bark. And so because of that, we did supplementally feed them. And what were we testing? In year 2001, we tested having 5 young goats versus 20 young goats in a quarter acre paddock. We also tested out using a supplement, which was a 16% crude protein goat pellet of some sort, versus doing rotational feeding where the animals would be in one of these woodland pens for 7 days, and then another 7 days in a new one. And then they would go into a pasture near the woodland, a meadow area basically, for 2 weeks to graze grasses and forbs instead. In the second year of the study, we compared feeds that were 12% protein. They actually were slightly less than 12% protein versus ones that were 14% protein, and feeds that were low in fiber versus normal in fiber. The thinking being that, maybe they need to be on low fiber feeds, so feeds that are high in carbohydrate, say corn, because we want them to eat the bark, which we assumed was high in fiber. What we didn't really realize is that often the bark is low in fermentable fiber. A lot of that fiber is indigestible. And then the third year, we looked at using juvenile animal goats versus mature goats. Very early on, realized that the mature goats ran out of food and would after 3 or 4 days. And if we wanted them not to girdle our hardwoods, we needed to move them in that 3 to 4 day period rather than in the 7-day period we were using on the young goats. And we looked at a 16% crude protein total mixed ration that was came from a local mill versus a farm mixture of corn and soybeans, which was also about 14 to 16% crude protein. And the gold font indicates the best control for undesirable saplings. Blue font indicates pretty much when there was really low control, basically a failure of controlling those saplings. And what was interesting also is the gold font also indicated the treatments where the goats gained the best weight versus the blue being where the goats gained the least weight. And we found that 5 goats per acre, that there wasn't enough herd dynamics with that or herd competition with that. And those goats tended to laze around. If it was a rainy day, they would stay inside their shelter all day, versus with 20, there was that competition to get out there and eat. We also found that those low nutrition fiber diets, as I said before, didn't work well, and that a diet that was 12% protein or less did not work well. The animals, contrary to what we would think, the animals actually ate less when they were on insufficient supplemental feed. And here you can just see that when we look at the best treatment for each year, the animals on the best treatment did a very good job of killing striped maple, but beech was definitely more of a challenge for them to do. We found that with young goats, their teeth really have a problem girdling that beech bark. Though they can do it. We had one group of young goats that really imprinted it on that and did a great job. Okay. So in conclusion from this 3-year study, there was typically no damage to mature crop trees as long as we were keeping an eye on things and with the mature goats moving them within 3 to 4 days. We had consistently high mortality of striped maple saplings. Beech was more variable. Goats really liked the bark of striped maple, red maple, and hemlock, but they tended to avoid the bark of sugar maples, black birch, black cherries, red oak, and aspen. And we needed supplementary feed to perform well. We found that we were feeding about 2.5 to 3% dry matter. Actually, I don't think it was dry matter, it was as fed, but it was pretty high dry matter feeds in terms of body weight, and then 2% of body weight for mature goats. In the sugar bush, as I said, at the Arnett Forest, a lot of it was in sugar bush and the goats did quite well there. We also took these goats or had teams that were working throughout New York as in woodlot areas throughout New York, as well as at the Arnett Forest during this 3-year period. These are goats who were trying to reclaim an abandoned vineyard. The wires from the original vineyard were still there. The goats had a great time out here eating. They did eat all the old Concord grape vineyard, plants that were there. You can see if you look in on the left-hand photo at the back there, you can see huge thickets of Multiflora Rose. And the goats, in order for us to put up the fence, we would have to go in and chainsaw along the wire. And it was just miserable getting this fencing in there. But once it was in there, these goats just did a phenomenal job. And after a 3-year period, you can see the wires and everything. And it was pretty ready for the farmer to go ahead and plant a new vineyard. This is a study that was done at Glynwood Farm Center, looking at land they had that was heavily infested with Multiflora Rose. They wanted to, a lot of this land had originally been pastures and they wanted to go back to pasturing it. So they did 4 treatments. One was manual removal, where they went in the first year in about a 2-acre plot and ran 35 mature goats through there in a 10-day period, so that the people could get in there. And then people went in there and used chainsaws and brush cutters to clear it out, and then burn the piles of multiflora rose canes. There was a very high labor input, but they immediately opened up the land and started getting pasture plants from old seed there to develop. And then their plan was to rotationally graze this with goats and cattle to keep the volunteer multiflora rose and other woody plants under control. Another treatment was rotationally grazing the goats through this, with the goal of sustaining the multiflora rose and having many years of grazing for goats there. And this is the way Glynwood does much of their lands, even to this day. And a large group of goats stay in each paddock until most of the multiflora rose leaves and growing points are eaten. And then they're moved to a new paddock to keep grazing. And then they return. They keep rotating through the pastures, and they don't return to that paddock, to any paddock, until the leaves have regrown. And they found that this provides sustainable, good, nutritious feed for goats, but the pasture does remain infested with multiflora rose. They found that the plants were about 25% smaller in pastures than pastures that weren't being grazed by goats, but instead and then they did a continuous grazing study. This was a more formal study on a little bit more than a half acre of land, where the first year they ran 13 goats there, and they just kept the 13 goats in that paddock from May to September. In the second year, they cut it down to 6 goats being grazed there continuously from April to September. But in that second year, they pretty much had to supplement the goats with 4 pounds of hay per head per day, right from the start of the study, because the goats had really deteriorated the multiflora rose the first year. Their feeling was that they needed to leave the goats there continuously so that the regrowth was constantly being eaten. And I'm not that sure that that had to be done. Parasites definitely became internal parasites became a problem from leaving the goats in there all that period. And the multiflora rose biomass declined within the first 68 days of the first year of the study. It declined by about 39%. Versus they had a reference pasture, which is that last row there, same size pasture right next to it, where that from May to May, June, that same 68 days, the biomass increased by about 57%. At the end of the study, the 2-year study, the multiflora rose in the continuous grazing area had was essentially dead. It had an average condition of 1, which meant dead, versus in the other field, late in the season, then when your plants are going to be, leaves are fallen, they're not in as good condition. The plants had moderate condition, and we're definitely ready to go ahead and become huge tall plants again the next year. Here's some slides of treatment 1, which is where they did the mechanical thinning. And you can see this is within the first few days of grazing, the goats have made it so that humans can get into these thickets now. And then they piled up the multiflora rose that they had cleared and burned it. So very labor intensive. And then they were left with birdsfoot or with multiflora rose plants, but you can see that they're smaller. The growing points have really been taken back, and there's lots of grass around them. And so they were pretty happy with this technique, but felt that it was just extremely labor intensive. Treatment 2, which is where the goats are rotationally grazed through these pastures. The goats definitely cleared out a lot of thickets, but there's still multiflora rose there. And then as years go by, they bring the goats into an area when the multiflora rose looks about the way it does in that treatment 2 side to the left, or photo to the left. And then they take them out when they look like that middle picture. So they've eaten most of the leaves and the tips of the growing points, but they haven't started eating much of the grass. The grass is still there for the cattle that are going to be following in a few few weeks or in a month onto these same fields to rotationally graze through them. And what they did find, that photo on the right-hand side of that second column or second row, on the right-hand side of that photo is a pasture that they had been using this program with, and then for the 2 years of their study, they stopped grazing goats in there and only grazed cattle into the right-hand side. And so they, are showing what the growth of that multiflora rose was in the 2 years where there wasn't any goat grazing going on there. Treatment 3, the goats came in here and you can see there's lots of multiflora rose there. They immediately, within the first few days, really grazed much of it that was easy to graze off. And then at the end of the study, they were left with a lot of dead multiflora rose, but you can see that the grass is also pretty depleted. And they were suggesting, going in and frost seeding afterwards or no-till seeding in grasses afterwards. So one question would be, could they instead have grazed this early in the season and then again really hard late in the season for long periods of time, both those times? Or could they have used this as maybe a night shelter every night while they were, kept them in there the first 68 days, and then after that used it as a night shelter while they rotated them through other areas so that every night they would go ahead and graze off this regrowth. This was a study in North Carolina with an apple orchard that had been abandoned for 15 years and grown up into brambles and multiflora rose, and they wanted to bring it back. So they were looked at a control with no grazing. They had 2 replications of 30 goats per hectare, and then 2 replications with 17 goats and 2 to 3 steers. And what they found was that the 17 goats and 2 to 3 steers actually did quite a good job in these fields. The favorable pasture species and vegetative cover increased in both treatments, and multiflora rose was eliminated 100% with goats alone, but also 92% with that goat and steer combination. But 2 years later, they found that new sprouts were starting to sprout from these multiflora rose dead canes. So they did a second study where they, by this time they had a lot of pasture there, so they felt that they really could utilize steers pretty effectively. So they did 1.7 steers per acre and 3.4 goats, and compared that to using 1.7 steers alone. And they found that using the steers alone, the multiflora rose plants averaged 6 feet tall at the end of the grazing season, versus in the areas that were a mixture of goats and steers, they were 2 feet tall. So they recommended using co-species grazing. Cattle consume the grass. We already sort of went through this, that sheep consume grass and forbs. Goats are browsers. And so often a recommendation from many studies is that you can add about 1 to 2 mature goats per acre per head of beef cattle without decreasing your beef cattle production. But you have to decide whether it's worth it in terms of fencing or shelter, water, feeding modifications to have multiple species on your land, and also what the possible increases may be in parasite, predator, or health issues. These are, so some ways to use cattle is, you have your Kathy Hout method of teaching cows to eat weeds, and this also will work with sheep and goats. So you take individuals that you think are going to have a long-term influence in the herd, but you just take a small number of these because this is very labor intensive to do this training. So you might use young females or cow-daughter pairs. And the first day you give them a small quantity of a treat they already are familiar with twice a day in feed tubs. And you want the feed tubs work well because you're getting competition of these individual animals around those feed tubs, and also the animals imprint on the feed tubs and start going, hey, these will have good things in them. The next day you offer the same feed, but in a different form. Then over the next few days, you experiment with putting other strange feeds in them that you still know are very nutritious. So they're getting a very positive nutrition feedback. And then somewhere in there, you give them a feed that's got molasses, or you give them some molasses to introduce them to molasses. You might give them a feed that's a little hard to work on, like hay cubes or something that's a little more challenging. And then by day 5 or 6, you offer them your target weed that you've sprayed it with molasses. And then by day 7, you offer them that target weed alone. And once they're cleaning it up well, which should just be in a day or two, you're going to put them on target plots that contain that weed so that they can put the eating of it into practice while it's still clearly in their memory. And this can work well to teach cattle to eat to eat weeds, but they're never going to be really heavy browsers. They're never going to eat a lot of brush as a big part of their diet. It also can work with other animals. So that photo on the bottom right there is some bird's foot trefoil in a field that's been infested with Canadian thistle. And, I looked at that photo, I looked over her training methods, and I was going, man, at this farm with the sheep we're grazing here, really early on in the season, before we put the sheep out there, we should train them onto the Canadian thistle. And that way, when they go into these fields and the Canadian thistle is still young, they'll start grazing it rather than very preferentially grazing the bird's foot trefoil. A better way probably to utilize cattle in our area is to do bale bombs. As Brett Chudsoy has pointed out, that 20 cows in a 30-foot diameter around a round bale is about 1.5 million pounds of density per acre. And it can exert quite a lot of pressure on a brush plant. You need to do it when the ground is dry or frozen. You're not going to want to do this in heavy mud. You don't want to shove those bales up against valuable trees, and you don't want to repeat in the same place and over again. Really, even within this, you want to keep these bales moving around, because you don't want to build up heavy browse around your feeder roots and risk those feeder roots smothering. You can also use sheep. As we said, sheep are really good in browse, and with forbs. This is a study by Gary Koppel with purple loose stripe, and he's also worked he used Romney sheep here as compared to Jacobs or another breed, figuring that sheep that had evolved in marshlands are probably going to be fairly good at eating marshland type weeds. If you're maintaining orchards or vineyards, you want to decide whether you're going to alley crop that or whether you're going to silvopasture it. And if you're going to be alley cropping, where you're just putting animals down the center and keeping them away from those trees, you may be safe with several species, assuming that your goats don't get out of that electronet. And so sheep are often your best choice, regardless of which method you're using. And you really need to keep goats out of there if you've got young, high-risk trees, regardless of which method you're using generally. If you need to figure out if there's fruit present, if you acidosis and enterotoxemia, which is overeating disease, is a real risk if the animals aren't gradually accustomed to that fruit. I do know several livestock farmers or sheep farmers I work with who do graze apple drops, part of the year, and that's part of when they sell their freezer lamb, that's part of their advertisement is these sheep have been grazed on apples and somehow they'll taste appley to you. There also can be a listeria risk, though, if your drops are damaged or decomposing. So you need to keep that in mind. And then with silvopasture, we're definitely not talking about damaging your valuable hardwood trees, and we're not talking about areas where there's essentially no ground cover there. Instead, you usually need to work with a forester to figure out what kind of spacings or you need on your trees if you're planting them, or what spacings you need for thinning. You'll thin out the less valuable trees and get enough sunlight in there. And foresters are well trained to work with you on this so that you can have happy cattle, happy sheep, happy goats out there in the understory.